Road Chapter was founded on April 10th, 1865, as everyone knows. What they don't know is that the catalyst to the founding was a young man by the name of Galvin. Interestingly, his dad owned a hotel called Little's Hotel. It was on the corner of what is now East and Washington Street, and a couple of SIG alums from DePauw were young businessmen living in the big city of Indianapolis in 1865, and they took rooms at this hotel. And one of them's name was Frank McCord. And these guys were in their early 20s, and they convinced him to start a Sigma Chi chapter, Sigma Chi being only as old as Butler at that time. So they did, and the chapter was officially chartered on March 31st, and the initiation and founding ceremony took place on April 10th, which is interestingly one day after the Civil War ended, which gives us some perspective on how far back into history that really is. For the longest period of time, we rented space in a place it was the upper floor of a general store, and it was known as Moore's Hall. And it was a meeting hall. In fact, I have a copy of the lease, and we paid $60 a year, $5 a month. The chapter had no finances, no resources. They finally leased a home on Audubon Road in Irvington. It is still in existence. It's now a family home. It's on South Audubon. I think it's 209, if I'm not mistaken. And they lived there through the late teens and 20s, and until Butler itself moved to the far north side of Indianapolis at the end of the trolley line in a place called Fairview Park, which is, of course, Butler's campus today. Howard Caldwell Sr., who was in the class of 1914, he was part of a recruitment class that took this chapter from one member back to 6 or 7. The guy who saved this chapter, his name is Murray Matthews. Nobody knows who Murray Matthews is. He was in the class of, I think, 1913. We were a small chapter, and everybody graduated or left school, and he was the sole remaining member.
A story that cropped up from time to time. If you see Murray Matthews walking alone in deep thought, don't disturb him. He is holding his own private fraternity meeting. Morale was always high for the little group. They had their brotherly love in a concentrated form.
Instead of just giving up, he went out and recruited a bunch of new guys. And, I often tell the pledges when we talk about the history of the chapter that if that guy can save this chapter, what can you do? The class of 1950, which included not only Howard Caldwell Jr., but Doc Jackson and Mr. Keach and a bunch of other guys, legendary Sigma Chi's, they all were there. They all came back. That class had over 35 guys in it. Most of them were combat veterans. They had gone off and fought in World War II, come back, and gone to school on the GI Bill. A beautiful house was constructed on the corner of Clarendon and Hampton Drive. It was designed by the same architect who designed Jordan Hall, who was in fact a Sigma Chi. Tragically and somewhat famously, that chapter house was destroyed in an explosion of a water heater that was improperly installed.
On November 19th, we had the Cross and Shield dance with the Phi Delts down at the athletic club. We went to the dance that night, but I had hours at 1 o'clock. I was on the second floor in a room, and they had us sleeping very comfortably on mattresses on the floor. And so that's pretty much the last thing I remember, except then I woke up and I couldn't move. I figured out I was lying head down. Then I started hearing things like the sirens of ambulances and such, and I guess fire engines, I don't really know. And I kept yelling, help, help, and nobody came. All the time there was gravel sifting down, and I could feel them coming down because things were moving around, rocks and such. And pretty soon they were digging, and they kept digging and digging. I could feel that I was bleeding because the blood was running down on my face. And I said, stop, whatever you're doing, stop. Just grab my leg and pull me up. And they did. They just pulled me right out of that hole that I was in and got me up on the ground. And I was lying on my stomach on a stretcher. And I looked up, and there the dormers of the house were down on the ground. And that's when I fully realized, just what had happened.
half of what is now the existing chapter house, and that was the old Sigma Nu house, which had been our neighbors. Sigma Nu had built their house down at the end of the row, their modern house, and the chapter house at 655 West Hampton Drive. We lived there, and the House Corporation expanded that original facility, added the portico, the columns, and everything west of the front door, as well as the basement, and that created what we know as Row Chapter's chapter house today. I think they dedicated that in 1960 and moved into it officially.
The 60s were an interesting time because we started out in the 1950s essentially. I mean, it was technically the 60s, but it was like the 50s of Mad Men and Eisenhower. And by the mid to the late 60s, the assassinations of the Kennedys, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. So it was a time of great transition. The 100th was at the fraternity house. It was at the chapter house. We didn't have it off campus. But part of that week is that we had guests from the early 1900s who had been in the chapter house on the Irvington campus. They told great stories about what life was like 50 years before that, so 100 years before this time.
I was here from the fall of 1966 and graduated in 1971. Obviously, there were a multitude of changes in that short period of time. Probably one of the most significant things that was going on was the Vietnam War, and obviously it was escalating rapidly to a point in 1969 where late 69 they had a lottery. It was telecast, and there were a lot of anxious moments and a lot of happy and sad brothers at the time. Many years later, my son Andy chose Butler, and he was also called up one day and he says, I'm going to pledge. I said, great, what are you going to pledge? And he said, Sigma Chi, so I got a big smile on my face. And then I got the opportunity to come down and be part of his initiation. And I can remember him turning around like, who's going to do this to me? And I was standing there. He had no idea I was in town, but he turned around and saw me, and it was a very emotional and a very proud moment.
The one thing that strikes me is the resilience of this chapter. You know, we throw out the number 150 and it's just a couple of digits. But what it takes to survive for 150 years is a really remarkable thing as an organization. In fact, of the 240 odd chapters in Sigma Chi, we're the fourth oldest continuously chartered. Two of the four ahead of us are actually Indiana chapters, which tells you how strong we are in this state.
The International Peterson Award, given out by the General Fraternity, so it essentially is the benchmark for all of us to dedicate ourselves to achieve. We were awarded an International Peterson Award, and I know that over the next 15 years, we've been a consistent Peterson house.
I would say the chapter's at its strongest point that's been in a lot of years. The last 2-3 pledge classes we have been really strong. This most recent pledge class, I think, is one of the strongest we've had in a long time, and I think that we're really just on the rise at Butler and just as a whole. We're very involved on campus. We have lots more guys getting involved there. A lot of athletes, people involved in that, and overall just great brotherhood and just great guys in the house.
It's important to look back and to place some value on not only our traditions, but the roots of those traditions. And those roots are people. They're men like those guys who kept this place going and brought it, to the modern era and handed it to us. And we have to be good custodians of that tradition.